What would you do if someone judged you just by your appearance? Stick with us as we explore this powerful story of dignity, prejudice, and unexpected justice. If you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to support stories that inspire change. Together, let's spread the message of equality and kindness. The afternoon sun bathed the airport tarmac in golden light, reflecting off the sleek fuselage of the first-class cabin. Inside, the air buzzed with an air of exclusivity, the kind of atmosphere where even the faintest sound of ice clinking in crystal glasses spoke of refinement. Passengers, dressed in tailored suits and designer outfits, boarded the flight with ease, their expensive luggage rolling behind them. The cabin's muted tones of cream and gold, plush leather seats, and soft background music promised luxury and comfort for those lucky enough to afford it. As Margaret, the lead flight attendant, stood near the entrance, she exuded confidence and control. Her smile was warm and inviting, at least for some. She prided herself on delivering impeccable service, but her idea of impeccable often hinged on her snap judgments about the passengers. "Good afternoon, Mr. Raymond. Welcome back," she said with a bright smile as an elderly gentleman approached. He nodded politely, his wife clutching a small knitting bag as they found their seats. Margaret's tone was syrupy sweet, as though the Raymonds were longtime friends. Moments later, the atmosphere shifted. Stepping onto the plane was Olivia Harris, a striking black woman in her mid-30s. Her tailored navy blazer, paired with sleek slacks and polished heels, hinted at her success, though she wore it like a second skin, quietly, without ostentation. Olivia carried herself with a calm assurance, her presence commanding attention without effort. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but long enough for Olivia to notice. The warm greeting she'd extended to others evaporated, replaced by a curt nod and a clipped, "Welcome aboard." Without waiting for a response, Margaret turned her attention to the next passenger, her tone immediately softening again. Olivia's sharp eyes caught the shift, but she said nothing, letting her actions speak louder than her words. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, stepped further into the cabin, and found her seat near the window. As she settled in, she could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and something unspoken, discomfort perhaps. A few exchanged subtle glances, their whispered conversations muffled but unmistakable. Olivia met no one's gaze, choosing instead to take a sip from the bottled water in her bag and gaze out at the tarmac. The hush in the cabin was soon broken by Margaret's cheerful voice as she moved through the rows, offering refreshments. "Would you like champagne, Mr. Raymond? Or perhaps some sparkling water?" she asked, her tone light and pleasant. Margaret's attention to detail was evident as she fluffed pillows, adjusted blankets, and ensured that each passenger felt like royalty. But when Margaret passed Olivia's seat, her demeanor changed. She glanced at Olivia's carry-on bag, neatly tucked under the seat, with thinly veiled disapproval. Without a word or offer of service, she walked by, tray in hand. Olivia, noticing the omission, didn't react. She simply adjusted her seatbelt, her calm presence undisturbed. Margaret's behavior wasn't lost on everyone. A man seated across the aisle, dressed in a gray suit, noticed the disparity. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, opting instead to scroll through his tablet. A socialite a few rows ahead, with perfectly coiffed hair and a pearl necklace, glanced back at Olivia before whispering something to her companion. They both smirked. The subtle undercurrent of prejudice was palpable. Olivia wasn't blind to it, but she remained poised. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered such treatment, and she doubted it would be the last. Her approach, as always, was to lead with dignity. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her rounds, her focus primarily on those she deemed worthy of her attention. When she finally approached Olivia's row again, Olivia calmly asked, "Excuse me, may I have a glass of water, please?" Margaret froze for a moment, as though startled by the request. Her smile tightened. "Of course," she said, her tone clipped. She returned a few minutes later and set the glass on Olivia's tray without meeting her eyes. It wasn't just the service, it was the lack of acknowledgement, the unspoken message that Olivia didn't belong here. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, though no one openly addressed it. Whispers became more frequent. A man 2 rows back muttered under his breath, Why is she even in first class? His companion shrugged, his expression unreadable. Olivia remained unbothered on the surface, but inside, she catalogued every slight, every whispered word. She knew this was more than just poor service, it was a reflection of a deeper issue. Yet she also knew that the truth would reveal itself in time. The atmosphere of the cabin, once serene and inviting, now felt stifling. Margaret, perhaps sensing the shift, began to overcompensate, chatting more enthusiastically with the other passengers and offering extra snacks and drinks. But the more she ignored Olivia, the more obvious her bias became to the rest of the cabin. Even those who had initially been indifferent began to notice. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Olivia leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, projecting an aura of calm. She wasn't here to cause a scene, but she also wasn't here to be dismissed. Beneath her composed exterior, her mind worked methodically, planning her next move. And though Margaret couldn't have known it, her every action was being carefully observed, not just by Olivia, but by others who would soon play a key role in what was to come. Have you ever wondered what happens when hidden prejudices are exposed in the most unexpected ways? Stay with us as this story takes a dramatic turn. Don't forget to subscribe and like to keep these thought-provoking stories coming. The plane was now cruising at 35,000 feet, the cabin bathed in soft ambient light. Passengers settled into their seats, some sipping champagne, others immersed in their tablets or books. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of first-class luxury, the tension from earlier lingered. Margaret continued her rounds, her professionalism outwardly intact, but her underlying biases were becoming increasingly apparent. It was at this moment that David Dorn made his appearance. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, he exuded confidence as he walked up the aisle from the economy section. His presence turned a few heads, including Margaret's. Her demeanor shifted instantly. Her shoulders straightened, and her professional smile returned, radiating warmth and deference. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" Margaret asked, her tone bright and eager. David's sharp eyes flicked to her name tag before he responded, "Actually, yes. I'd like to discuss some concerns about your service." Margaret's smile faltered momentarily, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, sir. Please take a seat, and I'll assist you right away." David chose an empty seat near Olivia, his manner casual but deliberate. Margaret's assumption was clear. David, a well-dressed white man, must be a significant passenger. Little did she know, he wasn't here to enjoy first-class amenities. David was Olivia's assistant, accompanying her on this flight to conduct a covert quality control review of the airline service. David wasted no time putting Margaret's professionalism to the test. He began by making small, seemingly harmless requests. "Could you bring me a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Margaret nodded eagerly. "Right away, sir." When she returned with the drink, David inspected it closely. "This isn't cold enough. Could you please bring me another with extra ice this time?" Margaret hesitated, but obliged, her smile now strained. She returned moments later with the requested drink, only for David to ask about the menu options. "I noticed there's no vegan dish on the menu. Is it possible to get something customized?" Margaret's professionalism began to crack under the pressure. "I'll check with the kitchen, sir," she said, her tone clipped. Meanwhile, Olivia observed the exchange with quiet interest. She noticed how Margaret bent over backward to accommodate David's increasingly unreasonable requests, while continuing to overlook her entirely. Olivia remained silent, her calm demeanor masking a growing sense of frustration. Not for herself, but for the systemic issue this moment represented. David's requests escalated. He asked for a blanket, then complained it wasn't soft enough. He requested a different brand of bottled water, knowing full well it wasn't available. Each demand pushed Margaret further toward her breaking point, and her bias became glaringly obvious to the other passengers. Margaret's strained smile slipped entirely when David asked, "Would it be possible to move seats? I'd like to sit closer to the window." "Sir," she said, her voice tight, "we're at full capacity in first class." David raised an eyebrow. "I see an empty seat right there," he said, pointing to the seat next to Olivia. Margaret glanced at Olivia, her expression betraying her hesitation. "I'm afraid that seat is occupied," she replied quickly. David didn't press the issue, but the damage was done. Passengers began exchanging whispers, their unease growing as they realized the disparity in Margaret's treatment of Olivia compared to David. The socialite from earlier leaned toward her companion again. "It's obvious what's happening here," she murmured, her voice laced with disapproval. Margaret's behavior grew increasingly erratic as she struggled to maintain control of the cabin. When Olivia quietly asked for another glass of water, Margaret responded with a curt, "I'll get to it when I have a moment," before turning her attention to another passenger. David, observing the interaction, decided to intervene. "Excuse me," he said to Margaret, his tone calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice you've overlooked Miss Harris several times now. Is there a reason for that?" Margaret's face flushed. "I'm attending to all passengers as quickly as I can, sir," she said defensively. David's smile was polite, but his words carried weight. "I see. Perhaps you should ensure everyone receives equal attention. It would reflect better on the airline." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir." Moments later, she returned with a glass of water for Olivia, setting it down without a word. Olivia met her gaze briefly, her expression calm but knowing. Margaret quickly looked away, her discomfort palpable. By now, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely. Passengers who had previously ignored the tension were now openly discussing it. A businessman seated across from Olivia spoke up, addressing Margaret directly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Is there a reason this passenger isn't receiving the same level of service as the rest of us?" Margaret's eyes darted between the man and Olivia, her composure slipping further. "I assure you, sir, that's not the case," she said quickly. The businessman raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, his point made. Margaret's frustration reached its peak when David made one final request. "Could you bring me the name of the catering company for the in-flight meals? I'd like to make a recommendation for improvement." Margaret stared at him, her professionalism hanging by a thread. "I don't believe that's information I can provide, sir," she said, her tone icy. David's response was calm but pointed. "That's unfortunate. I'll make sure to include that in my feedback to the airline." Margaret's face turned red, her irritation impossible to hide. She turned on her heel and strode away, leaving the cabin in awkward silence. Throughout it all, Olivia remained composed, her presence a quiet counterpoint to Margaret's unraveling professionalism. She could have spoken up at any time, but she chose instead to let the situation unfold naturally. Her patience wasn't born of passivity, but of strategic foresight. She understood that actions spoke louder than words, and that the truth would soon reveal itself. As the flight continued, Olivia made brief eye contact with David, a subtle signal of understanding passing between them. They both knew the test was far from over, and the most revealing moments were yet to come. Her patience wasn't born of passivity, but of strategic foresight. She understood that actions spoke louder than words, and that the truth would soon reveal itself. As the flight continued, Olivia made brief eye contact with David, a subtle signal of understanding passing between them. They both knew the test was far from over, and the most revealing moments were yet to come. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a boiling point. Margaret, once the picture of control, now moved with a stiffness that betrayed her inner turmoil. The disparity in her treatment of passengers was no longer a secret. David's calculated challenges had exposed the cracks in her professionalism, and Olivia's quiet dignity had magnified them. As Margaret returned to the galley to regroup, the passengers exchanged murmurs that grew louder with every passing minute. Olivia, seated near the window, remained composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her calm demeanor only seemed to heighten the awareness of what was happening. The tipping point came when Margaret returned to Olivia's row. Her expression was tight as she approached, tray in hand, with a forced smile. "Miss Harris," she said curtly, placing a pre-packaged snack in front of her. "Here's your meal." Olivia glanced down at the plastic-wrapped item, a generic snack pack that bore no resemblance to the gourmet meals being served to other passengers. Around her, the whispers grew louder. Olivia looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, Margaret, this isn't what I ordered." Margaret's smile disappeared. "This is what we have available," she said, her tone clipped. "I see," Olivia said, her tone measured. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words filled the cabin. "And yet, I noticed other passengers receiving their selected meals without issue." Margaret stiffened. "Those passengers booked their meals in advance," she said, her voice sharp. "Perhaps there was an oversight with your reservation." Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "Perhaps," she said evenly, "or perhaps it's something else entirely." The socialite in pearls from earlier leaned toward her companion, whispering audibly, "She's being difficult on purpose. Some people just want attention." Her companion nodded, though uneasily, but not everyone shared her sentiment. The businessman across the aisle, who had been watching silently until now, finally spoke. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Margaret, his tone polite but firm. "I've been on a lot of flights, and I've never seen service handled quite like this. Is there a reason why Miss Harris seems to be treated differently?" Margaret flushed. "Sir, I assure you, all passengers are treated equally." David, seated a few rows behind, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, that's clearly not the case," he said. His voice was calm but carried authority. "I've observed your interactions with everyone else, and it's obvious Miss Harris has been receiving less than equal treatment." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. The cabin had grown silent, every passenger now paying close attention. The weight of their stares seemed to press down on her, and her composure began to crumble. Olivia, still composed, decided it was time to take control of the narrative. She straightened in her seat and addressed Margaret directly, her tone firm but not unkind. "Margaret," she began, "I've remained quiet out of respect for your position and the role you play here. But respect is a two-way street, and I've noticed that it hasn't been reciprocated. Your behavior toward me, ignoring my requests, serving me last, and now offering me a meal that doesn't match the standard of the other passengers, has made it clear that you see me differently." Margaret stammered. I didn't mean—" Olivia held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to ask for accountability. If there was an issue with my reservation or service, I would have appreciated being informed rather than ignored." The cabin was utterly silent now, all eyes on Olivia. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone, Margaret included, to confront the uncomfortable truth. At that moment, David rose from his seat. "I think it's time to shed some light on the situation," he said, his voice carrying authority. "Margaret, you've made a lot of assumptions today, about Miss Harris and about me." Margaret blinked, confused. "Sir, I don't understand." "You assumed I was just another first-class passenger," David continued, stepping into the aisle. "But I'm not. I'm Miss Harris's assistant, and we're both here for a reason." Margaret's eyes widened as David pulled a small tablet from his pocket. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward her. On the display was Olivia's profile, CEO of a multinational corporation, philanthropist, and one of the airline's top investors. The revelation hit Margaret like a thunderclap. She staggered back a step, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process what she was seeing. "This flight wasn't just a trip for us," David continued. "It was an evaluation. Miss Harris and I are here to review the airline service as part of a broader initiative to ensure equity and professionalism across all flights." Margaret's face drained of color. I didn't know," she stammered. "If I had—" Olivia's voice cut through the air, calm but resolute. "That's the problem, Margaret. You didn't know, and yet you judged me. You treated me differently because of your assumptions, not because of anything I said or did." The whispers in the cabin weren't just background noise. They were like a rising tide of tension, ebbing and flowing with each passing second. The passengers, previously distracted by their champagne and magazines, were now riveted, their gazes darting between Olivia and Margaret as the weight of the moment settled over them. The socialite in pearls, who had earlier dismissed Olivia with a smirk, now seemed to shrink under the spotlight of her own guilt. Her fingers tightened around her designer clutch, and she turned her face away, as if hoping the act of avoidance might absolve her complicity. Across the aisle, the businessman who had stood up for Olivia leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, his expression both stern and vindicated. His small nod in Olivia's direction was one of acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition of her strength. Margaret, however, could no longer ignore the truth. Her composure, carefully maintained throughout the flight, crumbled visibly. Her face flushed, her hands trembling as she struggled to find her words. "Miss Harris," she stammered, her voice breaking under the strain of shame and regret. Her carefully rehearsed professionalism was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." For a moment, silence reigned. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable, as every passenger seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Olivia's response. Olivia turned her gaze toward Margaret, steady and unflinching. Her calm wasn't born of indifference. It carried the weight of someone who had endured this too many times before. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes spoke volumes of pain, resilience, and the quiet power of someone who knew the truth would eventually come to light. "Intentions matter," Olivia began, her voice low but resonant. "But so do actions. Today your actions haven't just reflected poorly on you. They've reflected poorly on the airline you represent." Margaret visibly recoiled at the words, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. Her lips parted as though to respond, but no sound came out. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the strength she once prided herself on had evaporated entirely. It was at that moment that the cockpit door swung open with a soft click, and the captain stepped into the cabin. His presence carried authority, and his crisp uniform and serious expression silenced even the whispers that had lingered moments before. He surveyed the room, his eyes moving quickly between Olivia, Margaret, and David, the tension in his jaw betraying his unease. "What's going on here?" the captain asked, his voice calm but firm. His tone suggested that he already suspected the answer, and his eyes lingered on Margaret, as though he could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. David stood, his movements deliberate, and stepped into the aisle. He adjusted his tie, his expression measured but purposeful. "Captain," he began, his voice carrying through the cabin with quiet authority, "there's been an incident involving discrimination against Miss Harris." The captain's brow furrowed, but David continued before he could respond. "Miss Harris isn't just a passenger. She's an investor and evaluator for the airline, and she's been documenting her experience throughout this flight." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The passengers who had been mere spectators now exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. The socialite's cheeks flushed a deep red, and she clasped her pearls, as if clutching them might provide some kind of solace. The businessman's expression remained steady, but his sharp intake of breath revealed his surprise. The captain's face paled, his posture straightening as the gravity of the situation settled on him. He turned to Olivia, his professional mask faltering slightly. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with something that almost resembled respect. "On behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for what you've experienced. I assure you this will be addressed immediately." The sincerity in his tone was clear, but Olivia's expression didn't waver. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, her calm demeanor unchanged, but the faintest flicker of disappointment crossed her features. This apology wasn't the first she'd received in her life, and she doubted it would be the last. Margaret, still standing a few steps away, finally broke the silence. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible, "is there anything I can do to make this right?" Olivia turned to her, tilting her head slightly as she considered the question. The air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken tension. When Olivia finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. "The first step," Olivia said, her voice steady, "is to understand the harm that's been done, not just to me, but to everyone who watched this happen and felt powerless to intervene. The second step is to ensure it doesn't happen again." Margaret's tears finally fell, silent and unchecked. She nodded, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I will." Olivia regarded her for a moment longer before turning back to her seat. The interaction was over, but the impact of her words would linger, reverberating through the lives of everyone in the cabin. As the plane began its descent, the passengers remained silent, their earlier whispers replaced by a collective introspection. They had witnessed something profound, an act of quiet strength that had exposed prejudice and demanded accountability. It was a moment none of them would forget, and for some, it would mark the beginning of their own journeys toward understanding and change. Breaking the silence, Olivia rose from her seat. She moved with calm deliberation, her posture and steady gaze commanding the room without a single word. Every passenger's eyes were on her, not because she demanded their attention, but because her presence made it impossible to look away. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and calm, yet resonating with a quiet authority. "I want to thank those of you who spoke up today. It takes courage to stand against what's wrong, especially in the moment it happens." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the cabin, locking eyes briefly with the businessman who had defended her and the young woman who had wiped away a tear. Some nodded back, their acknowledgement subtle but heartfelt. Others looked down, avoiding her eyes, the weight of their earlier silence heavy on their shoulders. "Prejudice," Olivia continued, her tone unwavering, "doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's quiet. It thrives when people look the other way, when discomfort stops them from speaking up, or when they convince themselves it's someone else's problem." She let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them sink in. The silence that followed wasn't uneasy. It was reflective, the kind of silence where growth begins. "But it only takes one voice to change that," she added, her voice softening slightly. "One person willing to say, 'This isn't okay.' Today, some of you were that voice, and for that, I am grateful." The applause that followed wasn't loud or exuberant. It was measured, meaningful, like the first steps towards something larger. The businessman gave a firm nod as he clapped, while the socialite joined hesitantly, her hands coming together softly, as if unsure she had earned the right to participate. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the cabin, quiet but profound. As the clapping faded, Olivia nodded graciously, then returned to her seat. Her movements were composed, her expression calm, but her eyes carried a spark of resolute determination. She had planted a seed, and now it was up to the passengers and the world beyond the cabin to ensure it grew. The cabin descended into a pensive quiet after Olivia's address. The passengers, still processing her words, barely noticed as the plane began its descent. Each person seemed lost in their thoughts, replaying the events of the flight, their own roles in the drama, and what they might have done differently. Margaret, however, sat alone in the galley, far from the passengers she had once served. Her crisp uniform now felt constricting, her polished shoes like lead weights on her feet. The reality of her actions and the consequences they had brought pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. Her thoughts spiraled between regret, self-recrimination, and a growing awareness of how much she had misjudged not just Olivia, but herself. In the cabin, the passengers' feelings were just as mixed. The businessman felt vindicated, but he also wondered why he hadn't spoken up sooner. The socialite in pearls wrestled with shame, her earlier dismissal of Olivia now glaringly apparent in hindsight. A few passengers sat quietly, their eyes fixed on nothing, reflecting on how easy it had been to stay silent, and how that silence had contributed to the problem. When the plane landed, the weight of those unspoken thoughts was still palpable. As Margaret was escorted out of the galley by the airline executives, the passengers watched her leave. She moved slowly, her shoulders slumped, no longer the authoritative figure who had greeted them at the start of the flight. Her presence, once commanding, was now diminished, replaced by a vulnerability that was hard to watch. Olivia watched Margaret's departure in silence, her expression unreadable. This wasn't about revenge or even satisfaction. It was about accountability. Watching Margaret leave wasn't a victory. It was a reminder of how far society still had to go. Olivia knew that this moment wasn't just about one person being held accountable. It was a step toward dismantling the systems that allowed prejudice to persist. When the plane doors opened, Margaret stepped onto the jet bridge, where a group of airline executives and HR representatives waited for her. Their faces were stern but professional, their eyes scanning her as though already taking stock of her mistakes. "Miss Hargrove," one of them began, her voice even but firm, "you are being placed on immediate suspension pending a formal investigation into today's events. Miss Harris's documentation, along with passenger statements, will be reviewed thoroughly." Margaret nodded, her throat too dry to respond. She handed over her ID badge and tucked her hands into the pockets of her uniform to keep them from trembling. As she walked away from the group, her steps felt heavy, like every misstep she'd taken during the flight was weighing her down. In her heart, Margaret knew this wasn't just about her. She wasn't the first flight attendant to make assumptions about a passenger, and she wouldn't be the last. But today, her actions had been exposed for the world to see, and the consequences were inevitable. For the first time, she realized the depth of her own biases and how much they had cost her. Back on the plane, Olivia remained seated, her gaze drifting out the window. She had seen Margaret's exit, her slumped posture and defeated expression. Olivia didn't feel triumphant, only resolved. This wasn't about one person's punishment. It was about making sure that the systems that allowed such behavior to go unchecked were finally confronted and changed. She exhaled softly as the jet began to refuel for its next journey. The world beyond the cabin was vast and unyielding, but Olivia knew that change, even incremental, was possible. Today had been a step, a small one, but one that could lead to something much larger. The events of the flight didn't end when the passengers disembarked. They rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. For Olivia Harris, Margaret Hargrove, and everyone who had witnessed or participated in the confrontation, the experience became a catalyst for reflection, growth, and change. A week later, Olivia sat in her office, the glow of the city skyline casting soft light across her desk. A framed photo of her late mother rested near her computer, a constant reminder of the values she carried with her: resilience, dignity, and the belief that change was always possible. Her assistant David entered, carrying a stack of reports. "These are the initial findings from the airline's internal review," he said, setting them down gently. "They're implementing mandatory equity training for all staff, frontline employees, management, everyone." Olivia nodded, flipping through the papers. The airline's response had been swift: a public apology, a commitment to address systemic bias, and a promise to overhaul its training programs. But Olivia knew the real work was just beginning. "Good," she said, her tone even. "Now we need to make sure they follow through." David hesitated before speaking. "You've received a lot of media attention since the story broke. People are calling you a role model. How do you feel about that?" Olivia looked up, her gaze steady but thoughtful. "I didn't do this to become a role model," she replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. If that inspires people, then good. But the goal isn't attention, it's accountability." She leaned back in her chair, her mind briefly drifting back to the flight. She thought of Margaret's trembling apology, the passengers' reflective silence, and the applause that had followed her address. Each moment had carried its own weight, its own meaning. But what mattered most was what came next. Meanwhile, Margaret Hargrove faced the fallout of her actions. Her suspension had been swift, and her once pristine record now bore a stain she couldn't ignore. But for Margaret, the hardest part wasn't the professional consequences. It was confronting herself. Sitting in a small conference room on her first day of equity training, Margaret felt out of place. She glanced around at the other participants, a mix of employees from different departments, and felt the sting of shame. She wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation. The trainer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, began the session with a question. "What is bias, and how does it affect the way we see the world?" Margaret hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of her notebook. She thought about the flight, the assumptions she had made about Olivia, and the quiet dignity with which Olivia had dismantled them. "Bias," Margaret finally said, her voice soft but steady, "is seeing someone through a lens of your own assumptions instead of who they really are. It's dangerous because it's easy to justify until you realize the harm you've caused." The trainer nodded, encouraging her to continue. For the first time in years, Margaret felt vulnerable, but she also felt something else: hope. She wasn't proud of what had happened, but she was determined to learn from it. Over the weeks that followed, Margaret threw herself into the training, not just to fulfill her suspension requirements, but because she wanted to be better. She began mentoring new flight attendants, sharing her story openly as a cautionary tale. Don't let your assumptions dictate your actions, she told them. Every passenger deserves respect, no exceptions. For the airline, the incident was a wake-up call. Public scrutiny had forced them to acknowledge their shortcomings, and Olivia's documentation provided a clear roadmap for improvement. In the months that followed, they rolled out comprehensive equity training, revamped their service protocols, and created anonymous reporting channels for passengers and staff to address discrimination. The CEO issued a statement at a press conference, flanked by Olivia and David. "This isn't about fixing one mistake," the CEO said. "It's about creating a culture where mistakes like this don't happen in the first place. We're grateful to Ms. Harris for holding us accountable, and we're committed to earning back the trust of our passengers." The media coverage was widespread, with headlines praising Olivia's role in driving change. But Olivia remained focused on the bigger picture. "Policies are just the first step," she told reporters. "Real change comes from people, how we treat each other every day." The passengers who had shared the flight with Olivia carried the experience with them long after the journey ended. The businessman who had defended her wrote a letter to the airline, commending their response and urging them to uphold their commitments. "What I witnessed that day changed how I see my role as a bystander," he wrote. "Silence is complicity, and I won't make that mistake again." The socialite in pearls, whose initial judgment of Olivia had been harsh, found herself reflecting on her own biases. She attended a diversity seminar in her community, driven by a desire to understand perspectives beyond her own. "I realized I'd been living in a bubble," she later told a friend. That flight was a wake-up call. Even the young woman who had silently wept during the confrontation found her voice. She started a blog about everyday acts of courage, sharing stories of people who stood up against prejudice in their own lives. Her first post was titled, "The Woman Who Sat by the Window." Months after the flight, Olivia Harris stood backstage at a global equity and leadership conference, the low hum of an eager audience filling the massive auditorium. Her name had been called minutes ago, but she took a moment to ground herself, breathing deeply as she adjusted the cuffs of her tailored blazer. This wasn't just another speaking engagement. It was a culmination of the quiet, determined steps she had taken to turn one moment of confrontation into a movement for change. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Olivia walked to the center, her stride deliberate and calm, and surveyed the faces before her. Thousands of eyes were fixed on her. Leaders, activists, and everyday people who had been moved by her story. She stood for a moment in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. "When I boarded that flight," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of conviction, "I wasn't thinking about leadership or accountability or systemic change. I was just trying to get from one place to another, like so many of us do every day. But sometimes the simplest moments hold the greatest opportunities, and sometimes we're called to act, not because it's convenient, but because it's necessary." The auditorium was silent, her words drawing them in. "Let me be clear," she continued, her voice firm. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one airline. It's about something much bigger. It's about the assumptions we make without even realizing it. It's about the ways we dismiss, ignore, or diminish others because they don't fit the image of what we think belongs. It's about the silent complicity that lets prejudice thrive." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, her words sinking deep into the hearts of her audience. "But here's the thing. None of us are powerless. None of us are incapable of change. Every single one of us has the ability to confront our biases, to challenge injustice, and to hold ourselves and others accountable. It doesn't have to be a grand act. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one action, to spark something bigger." Her voice softened, but the intensity remained. "The question is, will you be that voice?" Olivia stepped forward, her presence filling the stage. "Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when we listen to each other, when we reflect on our own roles, and when we refuse to let silence be the answer. It happens when we decide that doing nothing is no longer an option." She glanced at the faces in the crowd, many of whom were nodding now, their expressions thoughtful. "I want to challenge you," she said, her tone growing more personal, as if speaking directly to each person in the room. Think about the times when you stayed silent. Think about the moments when you saw something that wasn't right and convinced yourself it wasn't your problem. And then ask yourself, what could I have done differently? Her gaze was piercing, her words like arrows finding their mark. This isn't about guilt, she added, her voice gentle. It's about growth. It's about recognizing that we're all a work in progress, and that the path to change begins with one step, one conversation, one decision to do better. The auditorium was utterly still, every word resonating like a ripple in still water. On that flight, Olivia continued, I was reminded of something profound. Prejudice doesn't need loud voices to survive. It only needs silence. But the good news is that change works the same way. It doesn't always start with a march or a manifesto. Sometimes it starts with a single person saying, "This isn't okay." And when that person is joined by another and another, the ripple becomes a wave. Her words swelled with conviction now, carrying the audience with her. We have the power to create that wave, to turn moments of discomfort into moments of courage, to choose action over apathy. And when we do, we don't just change systems, we change lives. As Olivia reached the end of her speech, she allowed herself a small, sincere smile. I didn't stand up on that plane to make a point or to go viral. I stood up because I believe in a world where dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. I believe in a world where no one has to fight to be treated as an equal. And I believe we all have a part to play in making that world a reality. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. My story isn't unique. It's one of many, and there will be countless others after mine. But what we do with these stories, how we let them shape our actions and our systems, that's what matters. That's how legacies are built, not by the moments themselves, but by what we choose to do after them. She stepped back, the room erupting into a thunderous standing ovation. But Olivia's thoughts weren't on the applause. Her mind was on the ripple she had set in motion, and the hope that others would carry it forward. Later that evening, in a quiet moment by her hotel window, Olivia gazed out at the lights of the city. She thought of the passengers on the flight, of Margaret, of the businessman who had spoken up, and of the socialite who had chosen reflection over denial. Each had played a part in a story that was still unfolding. She opened her laptop, typing a final message for the day. To anyone reading this, I want you to know you are more powerful than you think. Your voice matters, your actions matter, and your willingness to stand up for what's right can create a ripple that changes the world. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Make this moment the one that counts. Together, we can build a world where respect and equality are more than ideals. They're reality. She hit send and closed the laptop, the faint hum of the city below blending with her thoughts. Olivia smiled faintly, her reflection in the glass mirroring her resolve. The ripple starts with you, she thought, and sometimes that's all it takes.